Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of season 2 of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am Tierah, here again to ruin some more of your favorite movies and TV shows that mention infectious diseases by comparing them with the actual science. I have a degree in immunology and a master's in medical science, and I've always loved watching movies and TV shows, so combining them into this podcast was a natural for me. Today, I am talking about smallpox. Yay! Smallpox is one of the top 2 or 3 infectious disease killers in history, if we're talking by sheer numbers. It also has the distinction of being the only human virus that we've successfully eliminated from nature. And I say it that way because smallpox still exists. It's just not out in the wild for people to catch. To achieve such an amazing feat as eliminating a virus from the planet, humans across different countries, cultures, and ideologies had to come together in a global level of cooperation and effort that I don't think we've seen before or probably since, and that is pretty world-changing too. I have watched a few things that feature smallpox in order to talk about this. It's a bit like HIV and VX poison gas, in that it's almost a trope that certain types of shows will have an episode about this where it fits their overall theme. The primary thing that I've named the episode after is a 1975 movie called Winterhawk. This is a film set in 1845 in Montana about a Blackfoot chief trying to buy a cure to smallpox from white settlers who are, surprise, surprise, unsympathetic. Winterhawk is a bit of a challenge to watch. You have to get a subscription or a free trial to ScreenPix through Amazon Prime, but you can do that. I also watched 2 episodes of ER, their season 8 ender and season 9 opener, Deadwood season 1 episode 6, and House Season 7, Episode 7. I also read 2 books. There's In the Days of the Red River Rebellion by John McDougall and The Demon in the Freezer by Richard Preston. I really wanted to get a good idea of how this disease is portrayed and shown on screen and the real-life experiences of living through it. Because of that, this episode does mention some not fun things, like the Canadian residential school system and genocide, so please take care when listening.
People are dying. They have white man sickness.
Smallpox has been with us for many thousands of years, although almost certainly less than 10,000. The peopling of the Americas, the pre-colonial migration and settling of what we like to think of as the New World, began anywhere from 19 to 26,000 years ago, and possibly up to 30,000 years ago. Dates are hard to know for sure, and I am sure that historians will have much to add to what I'm saying here, but this migration and settling ended and the Americas were cut off from Europe and Asia by around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago as the last ice age ended. Although the Norse did end up settling in Greenland and along the coasts of Newfoundland for a limited amount of time, around 1000 CE, for the most part, North America was not known to exist and had no contact with the rest of the world or their diseases. I labor over this point because with the quote-unquote discovery of the New World in 1492, and in the couple hundred years that follow, smallpox was deliberately used as a biological warfare and a means of wiping out indigenous peoples ahead of colonizers. These indigenous tribes had never encountered smallpox before and thus didn't have immunity, so the infection was exceptionally deadly for them. Prior to 1518, there were no reported smallpox epidemics in the Caribbean, which is where the Spanish first made contact. But in that year, a Portuguese ship carrying black slaves that were infected with smallpox arrived and killed 50% of the indigenous people through disease. Before the arrival of Francisco Pizarro in Peru in 1532, smallpox had spread there along with scarlet fever and measles, which reduced the population of Peruvians by 85% within a couple of decades. Before 1492, the population of the Americas was estimated to be about 54 million people, mostly in Mexico, Central America, and the Andes Mountains, with about 17 million in Mexico itself. By the end of the 1500s, so 100 years later, there were 1 million Mexican indigenous people left, and that was reduced to 600,000 by the year 1800. It is estimated that 300 to 500 million people were killed by smallpox in the 20th century alone. The mummified remains of Pharaoh Ramses V, who died in 1157 BCE, provide the first credible evidence of smallpox infection, that being a thick lawn of bumps or pustules all over his face. There is a paper linked in the sources that has some good close-up pictures of his mummy if you want to see it. It's not that gruesome, so don't worry. He also had these pustules present on his abdomen and his scrotum, which there's not pictures of, which was noted as being enlarged, though, and this was stated as possible evidence of him having a hernia, or maybe because he had an ulcer against his right hip in the crotchal area that he might have had bubonic plague. I personally doubt that he had the plague, though, because that would have been his cause of death, especially with a huge erupted bubo on his inguinal area. Inguinal being the proper name for the crotchal area. And for him to have had the plague and smallpox at the same time, the dude would have been the most unlucky person in history. The ulcerated area is probably just a patch of smallpox blisters that merge together, which is a thing that can happen, and I'll talk about more later. The plague, as in the bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, if you remember from season 1, may have been circulating around Asia between 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, putting it being in Egypt and affecting our friend of the podcast Ramses within the realm of possibility. So the plague most likely was in Egypt in the 1150s BCE when Ramses V died, and the pharaoh could have had it. However, the presence of smallpox virus in his mummy was confirmed with electron microscopy. That makes smallpox being present with humans for almost 3,200 years for sure, and we can imagine quite a bit before that. Now, the thing about smallpox is that it has no animal reservoir. This is why we were able to eliminate it from circulation. But that means that for the disease to be able to sustain itself and not die out, the density of humans living together has to be high enough to ensure transmission. Especially for a disease like smallpox that makes the infected person quite sick very quickly, basically takes them out of circulation by making them stay home alone while they recover. The minimum number of humans living in an area necessary to maintain smallpox is estimated to be about 200,000. That means it wouldn't have evolved until well after the development of agriculture and permanent settlements, which began happening, as I've said, around 10,000 years ago. There is no chronic, latent, or asymptomatic stage of the disease during which humans could be carrying and transmitting it without knowing. And the disease itself is acute, meaning short-term onset and intense disease, not something that will develop even over months that would allow inter-tribe travelers and migrants to spread the infection small group to small group. We know that smallpox was circulating in the 1100s BCE, likely before that, but without any other preserved evidence, it's hard to be sure how much before. As I've talked about a few times, relying on only written accounts to diagnose ancient illnesses and plagues is fraught with error, especially for a disease whose primary symptoms are pustules, a rash, and fever. Those symptoms are actually quite common, and there are other pox viruses that can cause similar breakouts on the skin. Hippocrates, pretty famous guy, known as the father of medicine, he was obsessed with systematically categorizing disease, but he makes no mention of smallpox. He lived around 460 to 370 BCE in Greece, so we can tell that at least smallpox wasn't in Europe at that time yet, or hadn't been seen for long enough that people forgot about it. Galen, another famous Greek physician who lived from 129 to 216 CE, so about 500 years after Hippocrates, he described the Antonine Plague, which swept through the Roman Empire from 165 to 180 CE in ways that match most closely with smallpox, although of course there is still some debate. Some theories say the Antonine Plague was typhus, but I've covered that earlier this season, so we know that a typhus rash is not a raised rash with bumps or pustules. Galen describes the rash as being pustular, rough, and ulcerated, becoming scabby and falling off, and in some cases being black with dried blood from the ulcers, which indicates hemorrhagic smallpox. He does describe a bloody diarrhea, though, and that most patients had a mid-grade fever, upset stomach, a phlegmatic or wet cough that sometimes produced bloody sputum, and even one patient coughing up a scab, indicating ulcerations down the digestive tract or in the lungs. I apologize for that. That's very gross. But yes, it's classic smallpox presentation also. He also describes the disease as appearing on the 9th to 12th day, and then the patients recovering within 3 days after that. Again, it's hard to say anything like this with absolute certainty, but evidence strongly points towards the Antonine Plague as being smallpox. As it spread through the Roman provinces, the mortality of the first wave was around 15 to 20%. But when it hit Rome again 30 years later in 191, that increased to 30 to 50%. In total, 7 to 8 million people died, which was 10 to 20% of Europe's entire population at the time. From there, we have mentions of smallpox in China and Korea in the 4th and 6th centuries, the latter being the time when smallpox was introduced to Japan through increased trade. And that basically becomes the way smallpox is spread around the world, through increasing trade and contact with new areas. By the 7th century, smallpox was back in North Africa and also Spain and Portugal. There are descriptions in Indian medical texts from the 8th century describing it too. So by around the 2nd century CE, the disease was endemic practically everywhere except the New World.
I come to get medicine.
Until now, I have been talking about smallpox as a single virus, and I haven't clarified what I mean. There are or were two smallpox viruses that infected humans, variola major and variola minor. They are very large DNA viruses that bring genes for all the necessary proteins they need along with them, meaning they don't need to use any of your cell's machinery. By very large, I mean it has about 186,000 base pairs that encode for about 200 genes. For reference, HIV is about 9,000 base pairs long, and that gets trimmed down to about 5,000 as it starts reproducing, and this codes for 9 genes. Poliovirus is about 7,500 base pairs long, with one long gene that is cleaved into 10 different proteins. Influenza is about 13,500 base pairs, coding for 11 proteins. These are all RNA viruses, so they are naturally smaller, but even some other DNA viruses are this size. Hepatitis B is 3,200 base pairs, parvovirus is 5,000, HPV is 8,000, while herpes simplex 1 is 152,000 base pairs, making smallpox, with 186,000 base pairs, still very large for a DNA virus. Larger generally means less reliant on the host cell for replication, but that also means perhaps a little slower to start replicating and causing illness because they first have to produce all their own proteins instead of just scavenging up what is already available in the cell. The name variola was coined in 570 CE by the Bishop of Aventicum, Marius Aventicensis, and comes from the Latin word varius, V-A-R-I-U-S, meaning changing, or various, as in different, indicating the speckled or spotted skin of the patients. Variola major and minor belong to the family called orthopoxviruses, which is a large family that has members that infect cows, monkeys, raccoons, skunks, mice, gerbils, voles, among a few others. There are poxviruses for everything, including mollusks, birds, bugs, everything. Just like everything has its own flea or louse, everything has its own pox virus too. Variola major likely came from gerbil pox by way of camels and camelpox, and variola minor came from major. The split from camelpox probably happened about 6,000 years ago, and its adaptation exclusively to humans happened 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, so the estimates above for when it began infecting humans are correct. Chickenpox, whose government name is Varicella zoster virus, is actually not a pox virus, it is a herpes virus. It's called chickenpox because British physician Thomas Fuller named it that in 1730 because the pockmarks on a child with chickenpox looked like they had been pecked by a chicken. Varicella also comes from the Latin for various, and it is pronounced varicella, not varicella. There is no soft C in Latin pronunciation. And I am looking at you, house writers, who told the actors how to pronounce this wrong.
We should test for the 21st century suspects, varicella and measles.
Measles, another pustule-causing virus, also not a pox virus. That is a paramyxovirus. That's a group that contains mumps, human parainfluenza viruses, canine distemper virus, cetacean morbillivirus, which is dolphin and porpoise measles, as well as rinderpest, which was a cattle virus, and it is the only other virus that humans have successfully eliminated from the environment. I would love to talk more about rinderpest, but I will save that for a later season on animal pathogens. Another disease that originally went by the name the Great Pox was syphilis, but that is also not a pox virus. It is caused by the bacteria Treponema pallidum. Syphilis also was called Posenplattern or Bosenblattern by the Germans, both terms meaning bad pox or malacia delicative pustule. I'm not sure I pronounced that properly, but it means disease of the bad pox. The French called it gros verrol, which means great pox, to distinguish it from petit verrol, which was the term for smallpox. Syphilis does produce a crop of pustules, though in a very different way than smallpox or chickenpox do. A few weeks after the initial infection, there'd be usually one painless ulcer on the genitals that could often go unnoticed, and it faded after a little while. Then there would be a short period of dormancy before a secondary stage where a localized pustule rash appeared on one or more parts of the body, usually the face, along with a flu-like illness. The disease has a second dormant stage then, if untreated, before becoming tertiary syphilis. And by that point, it's turning your brain and your nervous system into a sponge, and you are well and truly fucked. That is not how smallpox presents. Smallpox is an airborne disease that you can catch from simply being in the same building as someone with the virus. The average person with smallpox would spread the infection to about 3 to 6 other people through their respiratory droplets, giving it an R naught, the virus reproduction number, of 3.5 to 6. In some cases, though, one person can infect as many as 20 others, depending on the air circulation currents in a building. Some experimental data showed that aerosolized viral particles from these breathed out droplets could hang in the air for about 6 hours because they were relatively small. Larger droplets from sneezes or coughs would hang in the air less, although sneezing or coughing does also generate the small particles too, so it's kind of a wash. For smallpox, the smaller particles were the important mode of transmission because those would be breathed deep into the lungs and infect the lower respiratory tract, whereas the larger particles would make contact in the mucosal areas of the mouth and nose, and this only produced infection in around 1 to 2% of people tested. The rest of transmission would come from direct contact with the virus, say from particles landing on a break in the skin or even the mucosa around the eyes. After infection with variola major, the virus would grow and incubate for between 7 to 17 days, during which time you are not contagious. Then there would be an abrupt onset of very high fever, around 40 degrees C, severe chills, headaches, back pain, nausea, and frequent vomiting. You'd get to enjoy that for about 3 to 4 days before the rash would start. It would start out sort of generalized or localized, flat, with no pustules yet, but then by day 4 of the rash, the pox themselves would begin to break out all over the face and the extremities. This stage, as the rash develops, is when you are most contagious. By the 4th day, your pustules will be raised, fluid-filled, and have a dimple or an indentation in them and look a little bit like a donut. The rash being on the extremities is called the centrifugal rash of smallpox because it looks as if you spun the person around in a circle or like a centrifuge, and all the virus moved to their feet and hands and head. Then within a couple days of that, the pustules would spread back inward to cover the torso, and then it would go into your mouth and get your tongue and your throat. Now when I say rash, that word really doesn't do it justice. At first, the papules would be raised and 2 to 3 millimeters in diameter, and then on day 3, they'd grow to 2 to 5 millimeters, swell up, and be filled with a clear liquid with that dimple in the middle, which helps in distinguishing the rash from any other rash-like illness that you have. And when I say rash, I really mean your entire skin surface would be crammed full of pustules right next to each other with no clear skin between them. This is often called a lawn of pustules, and there are pictures in the show notes. This is something none of the shows got right, although as I talked about in episode 2 with Downton Abbey, the reality may just be too gruesome to depict accurately on screen. On day 5 of having the pustules, they would become highly inflamed and red, and then usually if you were going to die, it would be by about day 8 to 10 after the rash broke out. Death could come either from developing hemorrhagic smallpox, where your skin separates from the tissue underneath and you bleed to death under your skin and as the blood dries, your skin sloughs off. Or something called malignant or confluent smallpox, which is where your pustules, instead of staying slightly separate and defined, they would merge together and form a large fluid-filled blister, which is probably what happened to our pharaoh at the beginning. This happened more often in children and was almost always fatal. If you lived, then the pustules would scab over and slowly heal. Once the scabs were gone, then you were finally not contagious, although you'd continue to have fever and lessening symptoms for up to a month. 2/3 to 3/4 of people who survived were left with permanent white scars wherever there was a pockmark. Frequently, after having survived the smallpox, so post day 8 to 10, while your skin was healing, people would often get bacterial infections from having so many open wounds. This could lead to sepsis as well as blindness, and the virus itself could cause joint problems and limb deformities. If you did manage to survive, if you were pregnant, then the infection would cause loss of the pregnancy. Unfortunately, like I said, none of the shows I watched got the appearance of the pustules correct. It is very gruesome, and it would probably not be pleasant to put on TV, so I don't really know if I can blame them. It was likely done for aesthetic reasons. As I mentioned at the top, smallpox has almost become a trope in any sort of medical show or period piece. It's a plot point or set dressing used to advance storylines of characters, even on a show like House or ER. The point of having smallpox is not to tell the accurate story of smallpox or depict it, it's to create drama or to have a certain character show off their knowledge. House got the pustules the most correct, whereas in Deadwood, no one even developed so much as a pimple. They all just got sweaty and coughed a lot. One guy who was getting sick did say his back ached, and that's a symptom of the developing infection, so they get 1 point for that. The spots on ER weren't too bad, although they looked more like the kids fell into a box of styrofoam fluff and got the little bits stuck all over their face. ER got the timeline of infection the most correct, but in general, it all happened too quickly. Remember, it's 2 to 2.5 weeks of incubation before fever, 3 to 5 days of fever before the rash breaks out, and then 8 to 10 days of rash and pustules before death would occur, and then if you survived, up to a month of recovery. It's probably a constraint over telling a story in 45 minutes. The speed of infection and development from initial symptoms to the pox and then death in some cases, it was far too rapid. But we can suspend our disbelief for this. Although in ER, like I said, at least there's reference to patients with smallpox having been in the ER the previous week for a high fever and then coming back once the pustules developed. House did pretty well with having quarantines and isolation suits with their own breathing apparatus, which is something you'd have to wear to prevent catching smallpox while being around the sick people. ER didn't do so great on that, since all they did was have Carter and Abby wear little plastic face masks and disposable gowns. They also let most of the people in the hospital leave without quarantining them, and they only kept the 8 or so doctors and nurses who'd been in direct contact with the patients. A couple other people working in the hospital caught fevers, but nothing else, and none of the rest of the patients or workers there throughout the hospital caught it either, so the spread and multiplication of infection on ER was definitely not true to life. They explain this by saying that if you get vaccinated immediately, you won't experience severe symptoms. According to the CDC, if you're exposed to smallpox and you get vaccinated within 3 days, this can prevent disease completely or lessen the symptoms greatly. And this is because of that longer incubation period that I mentioned. So I guess that part is actually accurate. A few people in these shows do die from the infection, but from what in real life would appear to be a mild case of smallpox, definitely not from the hemorrhagic or confluent smallpox that caused the bulk of the fatalities.
Smallpox? You're going to have to burn everything this boy's touched.
One exception to the timeline issues is Winterhawk, but that's only because the smallpox itself is only displayed very briefly in the first 5 minutes of the movie and then never again. The characters have already died and are being laid to rest, while the rest of the movie is more about the search for a treatment and the tensions between the indigenous tribes and the white settlers. The rash shown was also definitely not accurate for a smallpox rash. It looked just like some red blotches, nothing raised or papular, and no one else in the tribe got sick after the initial couple of deaths. I think it's only 2 or maybe 3 people that died, so it's definitely not the 30 to 50%, sometimes 80% or more of fatalities that were typical of smallpox moving into unexposed indigenous populations, so that part was also definitely off. But Winterhawk did get the treatment of the dead people's things right, as in you would have to burn it all at that time to stop the spread. One description of the onset of smallpox is described in the book The Demon in the Freezer by Richard Preston, and it goes like this. The red areas spread into blotches across Peter Lose's face and arms, and within hours the blotches broke out into seas of tiny pimples. They were sharp-feeling, not itchy, and by nightfall they covered his face, arms, hands, and feet. Pimples were rising out of the soles of his feet and on the palms of his hands, and they were coming up in his scalp and in his mouth, too. During the night, the pimples developed tiny, blistery heads, and the heads continued to grow larger. They were rising all over his body, at the same speed, like a field of barley sprouting after rain. They were beginning to hurt dreadfully, and they were enlarging into boils. They had a waxy, hard look, and they seemed unripe. His fever soared abruptly and then began to rage. The rubbing of pajamas on his skin felt like a roasting fire. He was acutely conscious and very, very scared. The doctors didn't know what was wrong with him. By dawn on Thursday, his body had become a mass of knob-like blisters. They were everywhere, all over, even on his private parts, but they were clustered most thickly on his face and extremities. This is known as the centrifugal rash of smallpox. It looks as if some force at the center of the body is driving the rash out towards the face, hands, and feet. The inside of his mouth and ear canals and sinuses had pustulated, and the lining of the rectum may also have pustulated, as it will do in severe cases. Yet his mind was clear. When he coughed or tried to move, it felt as if his skin were pulling off of his body, that it would split or rupture. The blisters were hard and dry, and they didn't leak. They were like ball bearings embedded in the skin, with a soft, velvety feel on the surface. Each pustule had a dimple in the center. They were pressurized with an opalescent pus. The pustules began to touch one another, and finally they merged into confluent sheets that covered his body like a cobblestone street. The skin was torn away from its underlayers across much of his body, and the pustules on his face combined into a bubbled mass filled with fluid, until the skin of his face essentially detached from its underlayers and became a bag surrounding the tissues of his head. His tongue, gums, and hard palate were studded with pustules, yet his mouth was dry, and he could barely swallow. The virus had stripped the skin off of his body, both inside and out, and the pain would have seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature to endure. That is gruesome, but it describes obviously malignant smallpox. It goes on further to describe how the smell that would seep off of a smallpox patient even before the skin was broken and oozing was something that doctors came to be able to use as a diagnostic. A sickly, cloying odor would fill a room and a hallway even with a single patient being present. Later in the chapter, Preston describes how this one patient infected 17 other people, including one guy who only peeked through a tiny crack in an isolation doorway for under 1 minute, and people who were 2 floors away from him. So in ER, everyone in that hospital would have been quarantined, not just a few people who worked in the ER, and many of them would have gotten sick and died, not just one of the initial patients, although their vaccination strategy may have helped save them. All of this has been talking about variola major, though, and I haven't said much about variola minor. Towards the end of the 19th century, a milder form of smallpox was observed in Africa before it spread to America and Europe. Variola minor was similar to major, but all the symptoms were just milder. Only 1 to 2% of people would go on to die. Variola minor was often called alastrum or Kaffir pox, and was likely always there alongside regular smallpox. I don't think it evolved or split from variola major in the 19th century as a new thing. It was probably just so mild and minor that people didn't think it was the same thing and might have gotten it mixed up with measles or chickenpox. But we do know now that they are closely related enough that we can call them strains of the same virus thanks to our modern genetic testing. Do I think that in any of these shows the people actually had variola minor and not major? No, because the infections we see are not what they initially appear to be, at least in the cases of ER and house. Perhaps in Deadwood one could make an argument for variola minor since no one broke out in even a singular pustule, but I honestly would think it would be some sort of influenza rather than smallpox shown there.
The white man, not trade. Take furs. We have no medicine.
In the HIV episode this season and in the Black Death episode in season 1, I spoke about the CCR5 Delta 32 gene, and I'm going to bring it back now like I promised. Just to recap, humans normally have a chemical messenger protein receptor on their cells called CCR5, and there is a version of that gene that is missing 32 amino acids, making the protein non-functional. If a person has 2 copies of this Delta 32 gene instead of the full-sized one, they are resistant to HIV infection because the HIV virus must use this receptor to enter the cell. However, this gene variant can't have evolved in humans in response to HIV because HIV hasn't been infecting humans for long enough to have created sufficient evolutionary pressure. HIV only first infected humans around 1900 and has only been widely spread since the 1960s and 70s. As we've been discussing, smallpox has been in humans approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years, so that's more like the time span required for the spread of this gene to occur. Smallpox was largely a disease of children because once you got it, you were immune for life, so only people who could survive it would go on to have kids and pass on their genes. For a gene to either be selected for or against, it has to in some way affect your reproductive fitness. Any gene that helps you survive something that strikes in childhood before you go through puberty or have offspring, that gene is selected for because then you are still around to pass it on. I am speaking very generally, of course. Gene inheritance and expression is a big topic that I am making very simple here. If you want to learn more about genes and how they kind of want to survive, I recommend reading The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. It's a great entry-level read about genetics and how genes almost have this drive to reproduce and persist, even though they are not sentient. Okay, now let's talk about smallpox being used as a biological weapon.
I heard the Russians had some on ice. If a terrorist group got a hold of it.
Shut up, Jerry.
There have been many attempts at using disease as a weapon of war, even well before the discovery of the microbiological world. I mentioned the first well-recorded incident of this in the Black Death episode, where Mongols used their catapults to fling the bodies of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa, now called Feodosia in Ukraine. That was in 1346, and in 1495, Spanish troops mixed wine with the blood of leprosy patients to sell to the French. That's a terrible way to try to transmit leprosy, by the way. Not only would the alcohol in the wine probably kill the bacteria, stomach acid would get whatever that missed. But leprosy takes like 20 years to develop after infection anyways, so good luck trying to use that to stop some current conflict. Napoleon once tried flooding the plains around Mantua, Italy, to enhance the spread of malaria, and that might have worked. But in regards to smallpox, there was deliberate spread of the disease by colonial forces as they invaded North America and conquered it. This happened in South America by the Spanish and in North America by the British. The trope of the smallpox blanket is a thing for a reason. In Canada, these were often Hudson's Bay blankets, the white blanket with the bold red, green, yellow, and black stripes down one end. At the very beginning of Winterhawk, you can see one of the people being buried is wrapped in or covered by a Hudson's Bay blanket, and in the movie, a couple characters actually make winter coats out of the blankets. Now, there is no evidence that HBC themselves ever spread smallpox via their blankets on purpose, so I'm not saying that. But there is evidence that the British spread smallpox via blankets of some kind from patients during the French and Indian Wars from 1754 to 1767 at Fort Pitt, which is now called Pittsburgh. This evidence comes from letters sent by head of the British forces Sir Geoffrey Amherst to one of his field officers, Colonel Henry Bouquet, that read, "Could it not be contrived to send smallpox among these disaffected tribes of Indians?" And Bouquet's reply said, "I will try to inoculate them with some blankets that may fall into their hands." In a journal entry, British Captain Ecuyer wrote, "Out of our regard for 2 visiting chiefs, we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." For smallpox, contaminated materials like cups or clothing a patient had touched were not usually a good way to transmit the infection because the virus has to be breathed deep into the lungs. However, that doesn't account for how the blankets or handkerchief would have been used. People would have snuggled up in them, wrapped themselves up, rubbed their face on them, blown their nose on them, and come into very close contact with all the scabs and pus on the blankets from the patient who had done just the same thing with them previously. Body heat could have potentially played a role in warming up some of the particles, and if that person had any open wounds, the virus could have easily spread to them that way, because it takes as few as 10 viral particles to transmit the infection. Then, once a person has it, they spread it to other people themselves, regardless of blankets. So the other book I read for this, other than Demon in the Freezer, is called In the Days of the Red River Rebellion. It is written as a memoir by John McDougall, and he talks about the spread of smallpox in Indigenous tribes in Canada, and he mentions the rumors that smallpox had been spread intentionally, which we know actually happened. I'm going to talk about this for a bit and read you some of the book, since this is a real first-hand account of basically the same story that Winterhawk is trying to tell. McDougall was born in Upper Canada, aka Ontario, to a father who was a Methodist missionary, and he grew up speaking Ojibwe and Cree. I don't know if John and his father George were related to the William McDougall, who was the governor of Upper Canada and one of the fathers of Confederation. I did not have the resources to look into this and find that out, but there was no mention of any relation in the biographies that I read online, so I don't know. It's possible, though, given the name and the smaller size of the population in the area at the time, I just couldn't confirm that. Anyways, in the 1860s, John and his father decided to move their mission west and set up near Pigeon Lake in Alberta. He was a liaison between the government and the Indigenous peoples. He was present at the signing of Treaties 6 and 7, which cover approximately half the area of the province, and in this role he acted as a translator for the Blackfoot people. He fought against government policies that prohibited First Nations people from practicing their culture, such as participating in the Calgary Stampede. But, and there is a big but, he also started a mission near Morley, about 65 kilometers west of Calgary, and part of his mission was initially a day school and orphanage, with some children boarding on site with their parents' consent while their parents went on a 3-month-long hunting trip. By 1905, the church was not pleased with the way the school was being run, accusing the principal, a guy named Nidri, of quote-unquote going native, and the school was then shut down by the church in 1910. It was reopened in 1922 as a full-on residential school, but this was 5 years after McDougall's death, so he had no say in that direction. I have tried to do my due diligence and look into this guy before I talk too much about his book or come off as singing his praises too loudly, but his respect for the Indigenous people seems clear to me, having read a good chunk of his memoir. I do grant, though, that that is a first-hand account from him directly, so naturally it's going to be biased in his favor. He was part of a problematic religious system that tried to convert and eliminate the cultures of the Indigenous peoples, and there is no excuse for that. He himself seems to have pushed back against that as much as he could, and I think the first-hand stories he gives, especially of the spread of smallpox, they're valuable historical accounts. Considering Winterhawk is about the way Indigenous peoples faced down smallpox and begged for help against the white settlers, I think that providing this actual first-hand account is important here. Also, these stories, they don't really tend to get mentioned or taught in schools like they should be, so this is my little attempt at changing that. In his memoir, McDougall describes the spread of smallpox on the frontiers in Canada during Louis Riel's Red River Rebellion. If you're not from Canada and don't understand the cultural significance of that, then I forgive you. It is a pretty big deal in Canadian history, though. Riel was Métis, meaning half Indigenous and half French, and he was a leader in his community, holding positions in Métis government. From 1869 to 1870, he fought to protect his people from the encroachment of settlers onto Métis lands, and he named his colony the Red River Colony, which eventually became the province of Manitoba as a condition of ending his rebellion. He led another rebellion in 1885, and for that one, he was executed for treason. I've got a link to the Canadian Encyclopedia page on Riel if you want to brush up or learn about him. I don't have time on this podcast to go into that full history. I'm going to read from McDougall's memoir, though, and that is the setting, so I just wanted to give you some context. Just a note about language. As I read from this book, I will use the term Indian as it is used in the book, even though we know that's a misnomer because Columbus had no sense of direction. Some Indigenous people do use the term Indian to refer to themselves, so I can respect that choice, even though in Canada, a white person using the term Indian feels wrong to me because it can and is used in a derogatory, dismissive way. I believe it's more common in the US to use the term American Indian, so I will use that word as it is used in the book. There is a term that I will not be saying, as it was common then, but it is now known as an offensive term for someone who is Métis or anyone who has parents from two different cultures. So I'm going to use Métis in its place because I'm not about to go slinging slurs on this podcast. So this is from the book. The large gatherings of Indians during January, February, and March of 1870 were at the last points of timber around Calling Lake, and it took long journeys to reach them. Moreover, the winter was a very stormy one, with the roads always full and largely non-existent. I can assure my readers, as the spring of 1870 opened, there were some anxious souls in the Great West. To add to this, there came rumors of some fell disease to the south of us. It was said that the Indians beyond the border were dying by the hundreds. Smallpox was mentioned, and we shuddered at the sound, for we were 1,000 miles from a medical man and without medicine. One day a messenger came from Edmonton on horseback, bringing a letter from the Reverend Peter Campbell, asking me to send him by the bearer some sugar that he had stored in our provision shed. That night the Blackfeet stole 14 horses, Mr. Campbell's being the 14th, and his horse we found a few miles down the river, stabbed to death. Such were the existing conditions when some of our Métis population came in hurriedly from the plains, fleeing from the approaching smallpox. The tales these brought were alarming, and we felt the coming of the disease to us was inevitable. The Wood Crees would come in without fail, and as many of their young men had gone south on the warpath, the infection must come north. We did as instructed. We scattered the Métis. We closed our church services and took every precaution. But soon in came the large camps, and already the disease was well spread. We continued to urge isolation, and as many as listened, almost to a man, escaped. But there were many who were now diseased, and others who would not budge, and others extreme fatalists, and in a few days we were surrounded by disease. The sick and dying and dead were everywhere in our vicinity. However, our isolation cry saved many, and the deaths around us were few compared with the settlements and camps east and west and south of us. In the vicinity of St. Paul, where Reverend Mr. Lacombe was starting a mission, there was great mortality. It seems strange that all through the country the Roman Catholic priests encouraged people to congregate and gather in large camps. I firmly believe that hundreds of poor deluded folk became the victims of the congregating of the infected. The disease quickly assumed a most virulent form and became most deadly. Right out in full view of our dining room windows was a camp, in which all had died save one son, a young man, and the father. This son was now dying, and the poor father, heartbroken but assiduous in his attentions, was doing all he could for his boy. Presently the young man died, and the father rushed up to me for a bit of cotton or a shirt to bury him in. Rummaging among my things, I brought out an old shirt, which the sorrow-stricken man seized and ran down to dress his son's corpse in. I sat down to dinner, and as I ate, watched him. Having laid his boy out, he raised himself up, gave a great leap, and then himself fell down dead. I ran to him to make sure, and then came back to finish my dinner, and presently found myself feeling shame at my hard-heartedness. The fact was, we became accustomed to death and to scenes of sorrow and fearful destitution. Coming home one morning from a death particularly harrowing, I felt the grip of the disease, and had to lean up against the fence several times before I could reach home. Going into the house, I asked Mother and my wife to have our room emptied of everything, and then asked for a tub of hot water and a double dose of Dover's powder. Having taken the powder and got into the tub of hot water, I presently slid into bed under plenty of clothing, and from excruciating pain went off into a profuse perspiration which gave me relief. The pain in my back was almost unbearable for a time, but simple remedies did good in my case, and the next day I was again out amongst my patients. Just a side note here, Dover's powder was an old preparation of powder of ipecac, opium, and potassium sulfate. It was meant to treat gout, but was later recommended for general pains, insomnia, and diarrhea, and to induce vomiting and sweating, as you were coming down with a cold or fever, because that's what they thought made fevers better back then. To carry on from the book, from every direction came reports of disease and many deaths. At Moose Lake, east of us, A whole settlement died, and when the spot was silently approached by a lone traveler, the one survivor, a little boy, fled out of the unburied dead and took up considerable search and craft to catch this child and allay his fears and save him. Up the river between us and Edmonton, another camp of some 50 souls lay down and died, and but 2 children survived. I knew all of these and had lived amongst them at Pigeon Lake and on the plains. But in a few days, nay, a few hours, from strength and cunning and human might and skill, of which in large measure they were possessed, they fell before this terrible disease, which was now sweeping over our fair country.
What about the vaccine?
There are 2 important ways of preventing smallpox in people. One is variolation and one is vaccination. Variolation is with the smallpox variola virus itself, and this is the method that was used for 1,000 years or so before Edward Jenner discovered vaccination. Vaccination refers to using the cowpox vaccinia virus. Variolation is mentioned earliest in the Ayurvedic medicine from India and Nepal around 1000 CE and was practiced in China in the 16th and 17th centuries. Variolation involved taking dried smallpox scabs from people who had survived smallpox, grinding them up, and then either rubbing the powder into scratches on the arm or blowing them into the nasal passages in a process called insufflation. In Turkey, the procedure was to scratch the skin with a needle and then cover the scratches with smallpox pus. Variolation moved into Western Europe thanks to Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the wife of the English ambassador to Istanbul. And I'm going to take a few minutes to shout her out right now because we can thank her for smallpox being eliminated. Mary was born in 1689, and as a child, she dreamed of greatness. She wrote in her diary, "I'm going to write a history so uncommon," and she said she had the desire of catching the setting sun. In 1710 through 11, her father was trying to get her to marry a man, I shit you not, named Clotworthy Skeffington. She preferred Edward Wortley Montagu, though, and I would too when the other option had a name like Clotworthy. Montagu was the brother of her childhood friend that had died, but she probably liked him not out of romance, but out of financial reasons. She ended up eloping with him in 1712, and they spent a few years in England at court. Mary had lost her younger brother to smallpox in 1713, and she herself survived the disease in 1715 at the age of 26. In 1716, Lady Mary's husband was appointed ambassador to Constantinople, and she and her son accompanied him. There, she witnessed the practice of variolation, which was very common there, and in March 1718, she had her 5-year-old son Edward undergo the procedure, which makes him the first English person to experience it. Her family returned to England in 1718, but when a smallpox epidemic struck there in 1721, she then had her young daughter also variolated. In this intervening time, Lady Mary had tried to promote the process, but was not very successful because English people saw it as a quaint folk treatment. However, she was eventually successful in persuading Caroline of Ansbach, who was the Princess of Wales, to test out the treatment. Not on herself or the royal kids, don't be silly. They tested it out on 6 death row prisoners in Newgate Prison, who were offered the chance of variolation instead of execution. All of the prisoners, 3 men and 3 women, survived and were released, and this convinced the Princess of Wales that it was a good thing. She then had her own 2 daughters, Amelia and Caroline, variolated. Further safety trials were then conducted on 5 children who had been abandoned at a hospice. And people are complaining now that vaccine trials are rushed and not done properly. Can you imagine if the COVID vaccines had been forcibly tested out on children in orphanages rather than people who volunteered and gave informed consent? Lady Mary spent long years trying to convince people that inoculation, as she called it, was life-saving, and she even wrote and published a letter under a pseudonym in September 1722 trying to convince people. Also that year, the English Reverend Edmund Massey wrote and published, quote, "The Dangerous and Sinful Practice of Inoculation," where he insisted that diseases were divine retribution and punishment from God, and that interfering with that punishment was, quote, "diabolical operation, on par with blasphemy." Yes, the anti-vaccine movement has been around longer than the word vaccine or actual vaccination. Despite this, Lady Mary was successful in bringing variolation to the Western world in that the aristocracy took to having their kids go through it. The process was improved upon in 1767, 5 years after Lady Mary's death, by Robert Sutton, a Suffolk-based surgeon. He and his son Daniel inoculated sometimes over 400 people a day, peaking at around 70,000 people in a single year. Despite these numbers, though, it wasn't enough to really lower the incidence of smallpox significantly. I'm going to have to skip over a lot of interesting history here because the full story is too long to tell on this podcast, but there is a paper in the sources called The Life and Death of Smallpox, from which I'm taking much of this that you can go and read if you like. In 1772, Edward Jenner was a young doctor working in Berkeley who used the Sutton procedure for variolating people. The Sutton procedure was to use pus and scabs from people who had only had mild smallpox, and to use shallow scratching of the skin rather than something deeper that bled more. Jenner was a country physician and made his rounds in the rural areas of Gloucestershire, where he happened to notice that some people who he inoculated had a mild or undetectable reaction to the variolation, while normally people showed at least a few pockmarks and had a fever but recovered quickly. He learned from these people that many of them had previously had cowpox. In 1789, when swinepox started to spread in the area, Jenner inoculated his son Edward and 2 young maids with cowpox, and then later challenged them with smallpox and found they were immune. It took some time for the idea of using cowpox on a wide scale to prevent smallpox to really become something Jenner wanted to try. In 1796, Jenner took some pus from the cowpox pustules on the hand of the dairymaid Sarah Nelms and inoculated 8-year-old James Phipps, who was the son of Jenner's gardener. 6 weeks later, Jenner challenged Phipps with smallpox and he was immune. Jenner tried to publish a paper on this, but was rejected for lack of data, so 2 years later, Jenner published a 75-page book describing an additional 22 cases of cowpox vaccination, which resulted in smallpox immunity. That book was a hit, and all of a sudden, vaccination became popular. This development of the vaccine is well before any of the shows I watched are set. Deadwood is set in the 1870s, the same era as In the Days of the Red River Rebellion, and they repeatedly talk about the vaccine, as you heard in that last sound clip. Winterhawk is set in 1845 in Montana, but I doubt the vaccine would have been available on the frontiers of the West. The Blackfoot chief tries to trade for medicine, but that was also something people in the time and place would have had. One of the main advantages is that while you've been vaccinated for cowpox, you're not contagious with smallpox. Well, if you are variolated with smallpox, then you are contagious and have to quarantine. About 1 in 300 people who were variolated came down with a severe case of smallpox, which was often deadly. Vaccination with cowpox has a much lower rate of complications, and that means that approximately 1 to 4 people per 100,000 would develop encephalitis, and 1 person in every million vaccinated would develop serious smallpox and pass away. We are very lucky as a species that cowpox can infect humans, but only cause mild disease, and is close enough genetically to human smallpox that the immune response you develop is cross-protective against a more serious infection. Many other pox viruses will not infect humans, so having one exist in an animal that is very common to find living alongside humans was a bit of an evolutionary stroke of good luck. If it had been, say, like crab smallpox that was cross-reacted, we may never have discovered that. Smallpox vaccines have gone through 3 different generations since the days of scraping cowpox pus into your arm directly from someone else's pustule. Directly after that, cowpox was grown in the skin of cows and calves, and sometimes sheep, donkeys, or horses, and then the pus from those sores was used to vaccinate. Then, in the 1930s, some attenuated or weakened viruses were grown in eggs and rabbit testicles. By the 1960s and 70s, when more of the world got involved, most countries had their own versions of the vaccine, producing them in various ways. These are the vaccines that would have been available and given out in ER and house, those based on the live attenuated virus. A live attenuated vaccine is good because it produces a strong reaction in most people, but if you're immunocompromised in any way, if you're pregnant, if you have eczema, going through chemotherapy, if you're using corticosteroids, or if you're allergic to any sort of antifungal used as a preservative, you can't get a live attenuated smallpox vaccine. I thought the eczema caveat there was weird, so I looked it up, and apparently if you have or had eczema or atopic dermatitis, if you get the smallpox vaccine or get close to anyone who has been vaccinated within 3 weeks, you can risk developing something called eczema vaccinatum. That is where you are more prone to developing severe confluent smallpox and you have a high chance of dying. So there are a lot of gaps in people who cannot be vaccinated. But in the end, of course, we know that global eradication was still successful. The rest of the story of smallpox eradication and the origins of the anti-vaccine movement is very long, and I wish I had time to go over it more with you, but I do not. Behind the Bastards does a couple episodes on the origins of the anti-vaccine movement, and Andrew Wakefield if you want to learn more. As with other episodes this season, I mainly wanted to talk about the story of the disease up until the point in time when the thing I'm reviewing takes place. And for this episode, that is Winterhawk set in 1845. If you want to read a short book on the eradication that goes into a lot more detail about the use and the stockpiling of smallpox as a biological weapon, then do go find a copy of The Demon in the Freezer. It starts off a bit with the anthrax bioterrorism after 9/11, but then it has a lot of first-hand accounts and stories from people who worked on and ran the global campaign to eliminate the virus. It talks about modern vaccines, which were basically administered in a clinical method of variolation, scratching it into the skin. In 1965, the bifurcated needle was invented, and that replaced most other scratching methods. And this is what you can see people being vaccinated with in the ER episodes. I've got a screenshot in the notes. It's not very clear what is going on in the show. You can see it, but I also have an image of the bifurcated needle for you to look at. It allowed a drop of vaccine solution to be suspended between the two short prongs of the needle to deliver it right under the skin, because smallpox vaccination develops immunity best when it is given subcutaneously rather than intramuscular like most other vaccines. Again, the full vaccination story is far too long for me to do any justice to it here, as much as I would like to on top of everything I've already talked about, so I will have to leave it there. If I had to rank everything I watched for this episode in terms of what show is the most and least accurate, I do have to say House got most things correct in terms of transmission, spread, and symptoms, even if their timeline was very, very shortened, so I will give House 8 out of 10 test tubes. ER comes next. I'll also award them 8 out of 10, and then Winterhawk with 6, and then I'm gonna go Deadwood dead last with, 1, because what the fuck, no one even got a rash, let alone broke out in any pustules. Alright, that's all I have for this episode on smallpox of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. I am a researcher, not a doctor, so please don't take any of this as medical advice. It is for entertainment only. You can follow me on Facebook, TikTok, Blue Sky, and Instagram at Tierah Ruins Things, and you can find all kinds of things at Tierah Ruins Things on Substack, like the show notes and a transcript for every episode, as well as all my bonus materials like reading and listening lists, where I share other media that I've been enjoying. Also on Substack, you can support me ruining things by becoming a paid subscriber, or you can join my Patreon if that platform is the one you're already on and you like it better. With either of those subscriptions, you will get access to other upcoming bonus episodes and future Q&A sessions where I answer all your submitted questions about infectious diseases. I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing. The new theme song this season was written and provided by I Effigy, and you can follow them on Spotify. There's a link. If you have any suggestions for TV shows or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you'd like me to cover or questions you want me to answer, send them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com or just get in touch on any of those social medias that I mentioned above. See you all for the next and last episode where I will be talking about tuberculosis.